Good morning. Come on now. Good morning. I couldn't waste this moment without taking a picture of you all, right? This is a historic moment here, so I'm going to do that. And I got y'all, wave your hands behind it. All right, yes, no, we got to do this. We got to document this moment. But I wanted to share a couple of thoughts with you through these proverbs that have always enriched my lives. My name is Omar Eaton Martinez, and I'm going to talk about that more in a minute, but thank you for bringing clarity to the conversation. I love, see, this is interactive. This is what we do. So as you do for your ancestors, your children will do for you. So I want to repeat that. As you do for your ancestors, your children will do for you. And that hits home for me really big. I have 4 children, and they work me. They work me. So I got to keep that in front of my mind at all times. But the indigenous proverb that really has driven my work the last 4 or 5 years was shared with me by Richard Josie, the director of Collective Journeys, and is, what kind of ancestor will you be? And so that's just a thought-provoking question for all of us to ponder as we continue to lean in the great work that we've done for our communities and for our stories. I am Omar Eaton Martinez, the Senior Vice President for Historic Sites for the National Trust for Historic Preservation, where I have the great privilege of helping govern and guide 28 National Trust sites across the country, anything from presidential sites to sites of enslavement, to presidential sites that are sites of enslavement, to modernist architectural wonders, historic gardens, and many more. We get to really lean in the great aspirational goal to tell the full American story. And your Descendant community work, for me, is at the center of that success. I wanted to just give a few moments and give thanks, because I think that's something that's part of our ancestral lineage, is to give thanks. And I wanted to thank our partners here at the National Museum of African American History and Culture, particularly the Robert F. Smith Center. I wanted to thank my cousin department at the National Trust, the African American Cultural Heritage Action Fund. But specifically, I wanted to really call out a few names. I know you get in trouble when you start doing the names, but I couldn't help myself this morning. And I wanted to acknowledge the great work, guidance, and leadership of Dr. Michael Blakey, just a tremendous individual. We learn so much from you, sir. Sit at your feet, and your wisdom and grace in this great work has guided what we got to today. I also like to thank Jerome Bias for being part of the advisory committee, and a tremendous talent. I just learned you do textiles also. Michelle Lanier let me know that. I didn't know that you do textiles. He does furniture making, and he does a lot of work around foodways. He did a great monumental residency at the Belgrove Plantation, and we're just still kind of like reeling back from all the great things that came out of that experience, and hopefully we can replicate that. I wanted to thank also Luana Holland-Moore, our Director of Fellowships and Interpretive Strategies at the Action Fund, for her guidance and her skill set. Of course, you already heard from Dr. Doretha Williams, the Smith Fund Program Manager, Lisa Crawley from the Genealogy, the Family History Center, also part of the Robert F. Smith Center. And unfortunately, she wasn't with us today because she's took ill, so she's in our thoughts and prayers as she continues to heal. But I wanted to give extra special thanks to Hannah Scruggs and to Elon Cook-Lee. Please give it up for them. Hannah Scruggs, who is a genealogy reference assistant here at the Smith Center, and Elon Cook-Lee, who's our Director of Interpretation Education in our Historic Sites Department, which is the department I have the privilege of running. And I wanted to thank you. Thank you for your time. Thank you for your service. Thank you for your labor. This is not for the faint of heart. We understand that this is justice work, and reminded what Dr. Cornel West taught us in saying that justice is what love looks like in public. This is love work. I shared that with a smaller group yesterday before we went on our tour. And I just want to thank you for loving humanity through your activism, advocacy for these histories. So please give an applause for your own selves. And with that, I'd like to give a warm welcome and give way to the stage to my brother, Senior Vice President, Mr. Brent Leggs.
Good morning, everyone. So beautiful to be with this community of preservationists. I want to start by telling a story that in 1917, under the leadership of Mary B. Talbert, who was the national president of the National Association of Colored Women, they would organize the first successful Black Heritage Preservation Campaign in an effort to create a historic Mecca in memory of Frederick Douglass right here in Washington, D.C. And that place is called Cedar Hill. And Mary B. Talbert would write these words in The Crisis, which was the NAACP publication, and she stated, "We conclude that this is the psychological moment for us as women to show our true worth and prove that the Negro woman of today measures up to those strong and sainted women of our race, like Sojourner Truth, Harriet Tubman, Amanda Smith, Frances Ellen Watkins Harper, and others who passed through the fire of slavery. We believe the attainment of the goal of restoring Cedar Hill depends upon the enlistment of every Negro, man, woman, boy, and girl in America. We seriously realize that it will require us to mobilize all the resources of our association to show that we are not afraid to put ourselves on record as being able to save the home by one day's cooperative effort." In essence, their success and vision would birth the Black preservation movement in the United States. So as preservationists in the 21st century, we stand on a cultural vision and ethical commitment to growing our community's collective power. In solidarity with African Americans, a multiracial coalition is marching in the footsteps of earlier generations whose vision for equality and human rights continues to inspire. Nevertheless, the preservation movement is flawed. In the not too distant past, historic sites were preserved to reinforce the white majority's narrative and to communicate idealized but unevenly realized American values. Hence, too often, the historic imprint of Black people and descendants has been rendered invisible. Historic sites and their stewarding organizations work at a critical moment both in the trajectory of their institutions and the trajectory of history when preservation, culture, and creative thinking are ascending as essential methodologies for repairing past injustice and shaping equitable futures. I'm sure that we all agree that we need more sophisticated strategies that model and strengthen site stewardship and asset management, interpretation and programming, descendant leadership and public engagement, and fundraising for places imbued with a multiplicity of stories. That's why we're all here today, to exchange innovative ideas and best practices that advance this urgent work. Our goal is to reimagine, redesign, and redeploy historic preservation to address the needs of Black communities and the assets and stories that we steward. One essential piece of the work is training the present and next generation of preservationists to do the cultural and technical work needed to redress the imbalances in our field. From governance, management, and interpretation, our collective work will be devoted to explicitly lifting the profile and ensuring the preservation and interpretation of descendant histories representing a remarkable American legacy. By preserving these overlooked histories and telling their stories, preservationists inspire a commitment to equity and justice. Done right, historic places can foster real healing, true equity, and a validation of all Americans and their history. That's why we at the African American Cultural Heritage Action Fund harness the power of place and historic preservation to make a lasting contribution to the American landscape and to demonstrate that historic preservation is a tool for social justice. We've been glad to support Descendant and Gullah-led projects at St. Simons and Sapelo Islands in Georgia, in Galveston, Houston, and Dallas, Texas, a landscape and cemetery in Newport, Rhode Island, or at a Virginia-based presidential site in Orange, 2 homes on Pierce Street in Lynchburg, a museum in Alexandria, and a burial ground in Richmond, as a few examples. Our goal is to ensure the permanence of Blackness and center Black history at the core of American democracy, advance innovation and preservation practice through our new Descendant initiative in partnership with the Mellon Foundation, grow the preservation economy in Black communities, and create room for descendant and family stewards to reconstruct national identity. The future of the historic preservation movement in the United States is through descendant leadership. So let's start our opening plenary, and I will invite the panelists to please come to the stage and take your seats. Thank you.
One, two. Checking.
Check.
So I want to introduce our panelists, and I will start to my far left with Andrew Davenport. Andrew is a public historian at the Thomas Jefferson Foundation and director of Getting Word, African American Oral History Project. He is a U.S. History PhD candidate at Georgetown University. Davenport has published academic articles on Ralph Ellison in mid-century New York City, Thomas Jefferson's death and its legacies, and the influence of Black literature on post-World War II French culture. Davenport serves on the board of directors of the American Agora Foundation and is a member of the inaugural cohort of the White House Historical Association Next Gen Leadership Ambassadors. Let's welcome Andrew. Jerome Spears is a native of Baltimore, Maryland, a retired U.S. Army veteran with geography degrees from Morgan State University and the University of Hawaii. Over the years, he has used his formal training and other life experiences to champion the cause of uncovering and preserving his family's narrative and history. He authored an award-winning manuscript entitled, I've Got Your Back, where he chronicled his 8 linear ancestral families rising out from slavery to freedom and beyond, and used DNA and other advanced methods to find and then successfully contact distant relatives in Africa and other places around the world. Welcome, Jerome. Next is Michelle Lanier. Is an Afro-Carolina folklorist, oral historian, museum professional, filmmaker, and educator. A graduate of Spelman and UNC Chapel Hill, in 2018, Michelle became director of North Carolina's Historic Sites, a constellation of 26 museum spaces, historic structures, and landscapes, including the birthplace of Harriet Jacobs, the final resting place of Charlotte Hawkins Brown, and the space of witness to human bondage such as the state capitol, Stagville, and Somerset. What wasn't listed is she is the first African American to hold that position. Michelle is on faculty as a lecturing fellow at the Center for Documentary Studies at Duke University and has advised on numerous films, including Mossville, When Great Trees Fall, which she executive produced. In March of 2024, Michelle will host thought leaders in Edenton, North Carolina, at a new exhibit titled A Sojourn for Harriet Jacobs. Welcome, Michelle. And last, Anderson Flynn, who was born in Magazine Point, Alabama, also known as Africatown, and is a graduate of the Mobile County Training School in Alabama and St. Paul's College in Virginia. Anderson had played a foundational role in the founding many community organizations in the Africatown community, including the Mobile County Training School Alumni Association, where as the president led the Africatown Connections Blueway Project with the National Park Service Conservation, Trails, and Assistant Program in 2016. He was in the leadership role that coordinated the community response to the discovery of the Cotilda in 2019 with the Alabama Historical Commission, Smithsonian, and other partners. This initiative led to the establishment of the Africatown Heritage Preservation Foundation in 2019, which is one of our Action Fund grantees. Let's welcome Jerome. Thank you for being here. So as we start, what I would like to do is just to ask each panelist to share with our audience background on your projects and what motivates you or connects you to this work. And we'll start with you, Andrew.
Thanks, Brent. It's wonderful to be here. It's such an honor to be on this stage and in this World Historical Museum. Background on the project that I now direct is the Getting Word African American Oral History Project, which is now in its 30th year at Monticello, and it collects and preserves family histories and oral histories of families who were enslaved at Monticello and their descendants. And thus far, we've collected upwards of about 225 oral histories over the past 3 decades, the vast majority of which are with descendants of families who were enslaved by Thomas Jefferson in central Virginia. That work was actually initially inspired by the work at Somerset when the founders of the project, Dr. Diane Swan Wright and Lucia Stanton, whose nickname is Cinder, were doing field work trying to think in the early 90s about how they could reinterpret African American history at Monticello. They visited Somerset in North Carolina, so it's magnificent to be on the stage with Michelle Lanier. Personally, I grew up in Connecticut with my mom and my grandmother, and my grandmother would tell me stories about her experience on the Great Migration from Richmond. They were born in Jackson Ward neighborhood there, and they moved here to DC in the 1930s, and my grandmother's sisters and her brother went to Dunbar, and their father had gone to Howard School of Pharmacy in 1915, and I was fascinated in hearing stories about my grandmother's ancestors, and that's what inspired me to learn more about my African American history and ancestry on my mother's side, and my father's family is Irish. Happy St. Patrick's Day to everyone who's celebrating here. And as I grew up and learning about relatives who had passed for white, I was very interested in that narrative, and I hoped, as someone who was really interested in history and as someone who had stories kind of poured into them as a young person, and I was kind of designated for that role in my family, to learn more about my own family history, and that led me back to DC, led me back to Richmond, to Jackson Ward, and eventually back beyond 1870, that famous brick wall in African American genealogy, right? We all know it. And thanks to the work of preservationists, as Brent was speaking to earlier, people like Dr. Diane Swan Wright, like Lucia Stanton, like Nia Bates, like Gail Jessup White, Black women historians and their allies helped me and helped my family put our family back together. And now, as a historian, I try and give back to folks who are interested in their family history as well. Thank you.
Tell us your story, Jerome.
So, I guess people can hear me. I was born in Baltimore, and my family knew Baltimore until Roots came on with Alex Haley. And at the conclusion of Roots, we, like so many families, got with our people and said, what's our Roots story? And our grandparents sat us down, this is 1979, and they began to tell us about this place 100 miles south from Baltimore in southern Maryland called St. Mary's County. First time I even knew Maryland had that kind of real estate that far south. But so we were told all these stories, and my aunt had the presence of mind to tape record the conversations. And we still have those tapes to this day. We've digitized it and saved it. It was a rickety cassette tape at the time. But so we have all of the history given to us from our grandparents from those days in St. Mary's County. And you know, as you're growing, life kicks in and you start doing what you have to do. But I circled back after about 40 years and asked my aunt, who's in her 90s now and still alive, Auntie, do you still have the tape from my grandmother from 79? Of course I've got the tape. What do you think I did with it? So can I have it? Can I listen to it? And we plugged the tape in and we listened to my grandmother in her own voice, and she starts to rattle off things about Sodderly Plantation in Hollywood, Maryland, or Susquehanna Plantation down by the Patuxent, and Valley Lee in St. Mary's County, and St. Indigo's where the Jesuits were. And she's rattling off all these things, and because we're in modern times now where you got the internet, you just fat finger stuff in and hit the button, and all this knowledge just comes falling out the computer at you. Many instances, word for word, validating what she told us all those years ago. And so I was hooked. I became a fan of wanting to know more about the story. I wanted to validate as much of her narrative and my grandfather's narrative as I could. I also wanted to then find where there might have been some discrepancies and correct the record, because everyone's not going to get it all right. And so to the degree that we can make it as perfect as possible, so that when we're handing the baton to the next generation, they'll have a solid base to work with. That's kind of been my goal. And I've done a lot of work recently on DNA, and with 5 siblings all in the game, that's a lot of DNA to work back many generations. And so I'm heavily involved in that now. Happy to be here and glad to be doing the work.
Yeah, thank you. Michelle.
I am, first of all, so grateful to be here, and I want to acknowledge that the answer to the question of what inspires me to do the work and what's my journey into the work has to include all of you. There are people here from North Carolina, people like Jerome Bias and Carolyn Cole and Karen Hayes. I think Jory Bryant, I believe, is here from Stagville Descendant. I am called to do this work in a collective way. I believe it's a sacred calling. I believe that many of us as children were kind of emotionally and spiritually tapped by our ancestors to sit at those kitchen tables. For me, I have to call on the names of my ancestral parents, Margaret and James, who inspired a curiosity about our roots and our ancestors. I remember my father saying, his birth name was McCullers, and I remember him saying, the first person in our family to hold the name McCullers was given as a wedding present. And that human being who was given as a wedding present was made to walk from Mississippi to North Carolina on a wagon train, to be delivered like a package. I remember another story of my maternal grandmother, Ann Grace, saying that when she was in Philadelphia, her mother worked at a Quaker elder care facility, one of the first elder care facilities specifically for Black people, many of whom were formerly enslaved. My grandmother, who was a student, a freshman at Girls High at the time, remembers coming to visit her mother at work and her mother, Odell, said, "Come, Anne, I want you to meet someone." And there was an elder, a man, who boldly and courageously showed his back as archive, as testament to the fact that he had been whipped. And when my grandmother asked him, "Why did they do that to you?" he said, "Because I was running." This is a story I heard at her table. So I heard these stories with force and dignity and power. And as an English major at Spelman, I also was given the gift of contending with these narratives through the great canon of Black literature in the hands of Toni Morrison and Alice Walker. And so when later I would meet people through my interdisciplinary work as a folklorist who were not equipped to meet the horror of the experience of human bondage, I felt compelled to bring to them the medicine and the fortification that I had been offered through my people and through my books that I had read. And so being in the position of division director for North Carolina Historic Sites, being a part of a collective who gets to steward Somerset Place and Stagville and the state capitol and historic Edenton, where Harriet Jacobs hid in a garret that was only 3 feet high and 7 by 9 feet wide, is an act of resistance in solidarity with her family. To call the names of Violet and Lucy, who labored as enslaved people owned by President James K. Polk and his family. It's sacred work, and for me, my primary purpose is to call out their names and to know the textures and contours of their lives and of their souls, allow myself to be mesmerized by the miracle that they could create humanity in the face of one of the most inhumane experiences that this globe has ever seen, and then to invite people in to join me in that sacred experience.
Thank you for that, Michelle. And yeah, and I think just borrowing from your acknowledgement of your parents, I think we all should take a moment to acknowledge our parents or caretakers and just to say their names, Thelma and James. And, yeah. There you go. Yeah. Thank you for being here with us. Anderson, what's your story?
My story, as many of you know, Africatown is highly in the scene now. When I was growing up, we never really called it Africatown. There were different sections in the community, but each section was connected. And all the people were connected. You know, every morning I wake up, every evening I go to bed, I hear the voices. I'm hearing a voice right now of a lady, Belina McCants, born December the 14th, 1924. She'll pick up the telephone and call me and say, "Anderson, you know what you were trained to do." It is not only her voice, but the voice of Albert Murray, the voice of Dr. Benjamin F. Baker, the voice of Bill Clark, the voice of Curtis Hardin, the voice of Mamie Thurman. It's all these voices keeps talking to me. This morning we came in on the bus. It's very interesting because I didn't quite know where I was going. This is my first time being here. And the driver was my high school classmate. I had not seen in 20 years. Those voices are constantly in my life. I made a promise to the widow of Bill Clark that I will give all I can back to my community. My community was a community of rituals and traditions. Our churches would come together on the fifth Sunday. We had many ceremonies that brought the community together, from the Lantern Walk to carnations to other events. I have set out as a goal in terms of preserving not only the structures of our community, but the rituals and the values of our communities. Each time I go to Mobile, I live in Atlanta sometime, most times in Mobile. I was telling Brett this morning, next week we will have an intergenerational homemade kite event, which I brought back 7 years ago. We had these rituals where every generation fed the other generation. I learned from everyone. You waited your turn. You did the things that were taught to you. We had many little sayings, and one of those was the first lesson of life is to listen. The wiser owl sat on the oak. The more he saw, the less he spoke. The less he spoke, the more he heard. Why can't we be like that wise old bird? I learned that in the first grade. It is those kind of events, those kinds of lessons that I learned in Africatown. Every neighbor and mother was your mother. Every man was your father. Every event was inclusive. I talk to my daughter every day. I called her this morning, and we talked. And I said to her, what is the greatest thing, what is the greatest value that you have in life? What makes you special? She said, Daddy, I live my life because of you taught me, as I was taught. Treat others as you would like to have them treat you, and life would be good. Regardless of how bad people treat you, you do good anyway. I have a coach, my only living coach now, and we have many, many sports figures in our community, baseball players especially, Cleon Jones, Tony Agee, Billy Williams. This particular coach, Curtis Harden, played with Willie McCovey, was next door neighbors of Satchel Paige family. And he told me something as a part of his family. He said, Anderson Flynn, you have two choices in life. He said, you can have a pity party or you can beat it with success. He said, it's left up to you. He said, this community has made a decision to beat it with success. And I expect for you, one of the chosen ones, to help make that happen. So those elders motivate me every morning and every night. Thank you.
Thank you for that. That was so beautifully expressed. And what I thought was powerful about your words, Anderson, is you communicated exactly that we preserve culture and community. Literally, the buildings and landscapes are just a tool to be able to preserve the values of our cultural legacy that you just expressed. Thank you. I want to get you all's thoughts on how do you define, what's your definition of the word descendant in our work? And I know for some it's very specific, for others it's a broad context and an inclusive idea. How do you all view or define descendant engagement in historic preservation? That's for anyone.
Well, I guess I can start. For me, Descendant has to deal with the folks that are here now who know there was something that came before them, and to the extent or degree that they understand and have a appreciation for that, is where the magic kind of kicks in. I often talk about people can go from Tom to Chicken George to Kizzy to Kunta Kinte. They can rattle off the Haley lineage all the way back to 1767, and they don't know their own grandparent or their own great-grandparent in their own family. And we have to be responsible for making sure those folks know their history, know who they descend from. And if you know who you descend from, and you pass that down to the people that come behind you, then that descendancy can continue.
My definition perhaps a little bit inclusive but broader as well. Many times people will ask, are you a descendant of the Clotilda? Yes and no. And I say that because, you know, I knew the Keebys. I knew Lemuel Keeby. He had no children. His brother was Ted. His sister was Miss Evelyn. And my father used to make me go and work for Mr. Keeby all the time. And like I said earlier, you know, everybody in the community almost adopted you as a child. You were sort of adopted into the family. There were a number of people who had 8, 9, 10, 11, 12 kids in the family. You had small houses with a whole lot of people packed in that house. And so there were people raised in my community that I did not realize who their relatives were. So you said, well, you don't stay with them, but you were raised by them. Mm-hmm. And so you begin to call individuals uncle and aunt and even mama and daddy, and you didn't birth them, but you raised them. And so our community was a community of diversity in terms of connections in a very, very special way. We recognize more now than then who you were kin to. Now it's becoming more broader, more definitive in terms of how you define that. But even this day when I was growing up and many, many of the older people were in my community, I took my daughter home one time and I would go down, I said, this is my mother. And then we'd go to another house, this is my mother. And she said, Dad, how many mamas you got? I said, every one of them spanks me, you know. So it was a journey of love, and it was a journey of connections that was just as strong as the mother that birthed me, as the father that spun me out. That was the connection that I had in terms of my community and how I define descendants.
Mm-hmm. Andrew, Michelle?
Michelle, please.
I am really interested in this question. I think it's one that calls for maybe multiple answers. I love to think about two metaphors that I use a lot is concentric circles. Mm-hmm. And I also think about the metaphor of a prism. Anyone who's worked with me, you'll hear me say, but what's the prismatic approach? You know, let's complicate it. Let's add more facets to that monolith, and let's shine light. Let's get a fuller spectrum. Let's tell a more nuanced story. So I do believe that there is a simple answer, which is people who are absolutely sure that you are a descendant of enslaved people, and particularly if you know where your people labored in bondage, that is a definition. I think it's also what I call landkin. So maybe you don't specifically know the exact lineage into that space, but maybe through oral history, you know your people came up out of this place or this area, you know they were enslaved. So I think the land is also, this ecology is also a witness to us, but it's kindred. The land, the water, the flora, the fauna are also a part of our story. And then I think that there's this other thing that happens, which is intellectual descendants. I was sharing with my fellow panelists a story of going to Stagville and talking about the Great Barn, which was the largest agricultural building of its time when it was built just at the eve of the Civil War. And I was visiting with a group of students who were from the North Carolina School of Science and Math. I'm just really dinging on Jerome's matrix of identity right now because all of these things connect to him. But I said, mathematicians and scientists track their lineage. So if you win the Nobel Prize in physics, you know your lineage. You say, this was my teacher and this was that person's teacher. Same with great musicians. So I said to the students of the School of Science and Math, if you do not trace the lineage of engineering and science to the enslaved architects and artisans of Stagville, then you are marginalizing the intellectual contribution of these men and women who did have scientific minds. And so I do believe we can be intellectual descendants. I do believe that people sometimes have chosen ancestors. We know that to be true. We have to be careful, though, as we broaden out that definition of descendant, that those of us, if you're in a space where you're just inspired by the story, but have no land kinship or blood kinship, that when someone does show up who does have land kinship and blood kinship, that we privilege the intimacy of that experience and kind of stand back and hold the space for them to dance in the center of that work. So that's kind of my layered response of descendants and how I think we can interface with each other in across these different definitions.
Yeah, to riff on that, thank you, all of you. I think that descendant, broadly speaking, generally speaking, is someone who is living with the past and the present, who is aware and is cognizant of the ways that history affects the present day and their own being and their own family journey as well. I think in our work at Monticello with the Getting Word Oral History Project, we tend to center lineal descendants of families we know were enslaved at Monticello and at Thomas Jefferson's Poplar Forest as well. So families whose surnames we know from the historical record, and that can present all sorts of problems as well, but by centering descendants of families from the Gillette family, the Granger family, the Hughes family, the Hemmings family, that is who it is at the core of our work. And of course, we make space for and invite more people in as we learn more, as we do more research, and as they are doing more research and collaboration. So I tend to think of it in terms of concentric circles, who we center, but of course our oral histories we're interested in folks who can inform about a particular home place or a neighborhood in the diaspora from Central Virginia. And we've also interviewed white neighbors of black families who lived nearby, who can share light on experiences from the early 20th century. And of course, we interview people who don't necessarily know their connection yet, but maybe in 35 years or at some other point in the future, we will know based on what they share with us now. So I think that one of the most impactful things that we can do today, given how many unanswered questions there are still out there, and we all know there are many unanswered questions, is to preserve people's voices, as Anderson was saying, as we've all been saying thus far, in the story from abolition to today. And if we can get word to future generations about that migration, that history, that transference, then we may be able to connect the dots, not just today, but a little bit farther down the line as well. So I think centering folks that we're aware of, given that Monticello is a burial site, we need ethically to center those families that we are aware of and to make room for others as they come in.
So just building on that, let's continue to talk about preservation practice, and I want you to share with the audience a little bit more about, your work of excavating these hidden histories and stories. And in essence, a lot of our work as preservation is rescue work. How do you, with intention, engage descendants in helping to preserve historic buildings and landscapes, or mining these stories for broader interpretation? What does the work of preservation look like for you?
I'll jump.
Go ahead.
I guess I can talk about Sodderly Plantation in Hollywood, Maryland. As an example, one of my cousins, I call her cousin now because doing the DNA from Southern Maryland, we're all related to everybody else. And so I've recently discovered that not only she was a frontiers person, but she's also a related cousin as well. Her name was Agnes King Callum. And she did so much work in Southern Maryland, connecting the enslaved to the enslaver. She was able to garner records that got in front of the 1870 census so that we would see the full names of a lot of our ancestors for the first time, predating that census. And on Sodderly, I think it was something like 3,000 acres at its largest point. And over time, it would be sold and parceled off and things of that nature. And I think it's under 100 acres now, and it still exists to this day. Survived the War of 1812, the Civil War, and everything else. It's still there and thriving. But one of the things that was on that plantation was one of the slave cabins. And of course, in its heyday, there would have been a whole bunch of cabins because there was a whole bunch of people keeping that place running. But over time, they would fall into disrepair, or people would just destroy them. They don't want to see them anymore now that the heyday of slavery is over, or what have you. So it just came to be that one cabin was still there. And what Agnes King Callum told her family and anybody else that will listen, don't let that cabin go away. That cabin should be preserved. That cabin should be saved. That's where our history originates from. And while a lot of the narrative was dealing with the big house up on the hill, there was that little cabin down at the bottom of the hill that she put a lot of emphasis on and wanted to make sure everyone around her knew, whatever else happens, don't let them take that cabin away. And it's still there to this day, and many of the folks who are descendants now, we're kind of carrying that torch as well to talk about the house, talk about the history, talk about all those other narratives, but make sure that house is included. So when people visit, they just don't look at the chandelier and the china and whatever else might be. You go down that hill and you see where the people who helped to build this place and maintain it and keep it running, see what their lives were like. And if you tear that structure away, then the younger people who aren't as connected to the history, they'll never have something that's tangible, something they can put their hands on and touch and be in the roof of it where you can't even stand up straight because the roof was so low on the dirt floor and everything that goes with that. So that imagery is important to be preserved. And so that's one of the things that certainly is being done at Sodderly Plantation. So I'll offer that as an example.
Yeah, thank you.
We have quite a few structures that, I mean, I cannot think of any structure in North Carolina that hasn't been impacted by the story of slavery or the wake of slavery. I mean, even the 20th century site, the Charlotte Hawkins Brown Museum at Historic Palmer Memorial Institute, Dr. Brown is a descendant of enslaved people. And so the extension of kind of the arc of, what is the story of surviving human bondage and then the descendants of people who have survived and what they went on to create, I think is very important. I will tell a little bit of a story. So there's a woman in the room today named Carolyn Cole who comes from Johnston County, North Carolina. And for those of you who are from North Carolina, you know that Johnston County has, when you say those two words, many people attribute it to Klan country. And what we have discovered is that if a place is attributed to being a space of Klan activity, well, the Klan doesn't have a loud and violent presence in a vacuum. it's often that the Klan is pushing back in the face of Black uplift and entrepreneurship and self-determination. And so there's also a battlefield. The largest battle that occurred in North Carolina was at Bentonville Battlefield. And what Carolyn Cole will say, who's part of our North Carolina Historic Sites Alliance support group, is that before it was a battlefield, it was home. Not only was it home to Carolyn's ancestors, who some were enslaved, it was also the home to others who witnessed Sherman's army come through. The Cole and Monk plantation, and if the name Monk sounds familiar, yes, the ancestors of Thelonious Monk, the great jazz architect, would have been witness to the largest battle on North Carolina soil. And if the name Cole sounds familiar, yes, the ancestors of Nat King Cole and Natalie Cole also were witness. So as we are conserving land, battlefield land, that also was land that held the feet and the lives and the dreams and the love stories of people like the ancestors of Thelonious Monk and Nat King Cole. That's a part of our work. We're also, of course, always working to take good care of Somerset and Staggville. Staggville has some of the only extant slave dwellings that are quadruplexes. So if you go into one of the dwellings at Horton Grove, you will see 2 rooms down, 2 rooms up. And upon first glimpse, people, what a grand home for an enslaved person, not understanding that each one of those rooms was a home that could hold up to 10 people, if not more, and that the structures were built to preserve human property. And so those structures, I just authorized to get the water line from Durham County brought down to Horton Grove, so that, God forbid, if there is a fire emergency, we don't have the anxiety of not having enough water to make sure that those structures can be tended to in the case of such a situation. So these are just 2 examples of how we are working to preserve and conserve the landscapes and the material culture of people who lived and toiled in bondage.
Thank you.
There are several things that we're doing. Brett mentioned earlier that one of our projects with the National Park Service, the Blue Way Connection, I think Ann has been on that meeting with us, and that's another project that we're working on. And we're including we just received our Middle Passage marker that Ann and I have been working on for about 6 years, Ann, since 2017. We have received that. And one of the sites we want to place that marker is actually a place that we call Cotillo Landing, which is a section of Magazine Point where I grew up that you could get close to the water. And it is said that many of the Africans was let off on the boat butt naked in those mosquito-infested waterways in that area. So with the Blue Way Project, we've identified the baptism spot, because many of our churches baptized in the water. Lewis Landing, where Charlie Lewis settled when he moved away, and they still have residents there. We have Tin Top Alley, where we still have shotgun houses where people live in. There's a house that our commissioner has identified that was built by Descendants. They're in the process now of trying to renovate it within the community. So there's a lot of things going on in which places and spaces that we recognize need to be preserved and need to be talked about. Our own campus, in 1915, the community burned down. And the campus was really a Rosenwald campus. And we actually have buildings, we have pictures of the buildings that were on the campus that was housed in the Fisk Museum. And so those are the kind of things that we're doing, is really trying to identify those places that still exist, as well as those places that were sacred places and spaces that we can develop really an interpretive center of activities around those places. And so those are the type of things that we're doing with the help of the National Trust, with the help of colleges and universities, with the Middle Passage Marker program, and other partnerships to really highlight the significance. Of course, we are also working with our cemetery, with the Smithsonian. I talked with Mary earlier this week, who has been down to Mobile, and Kamal Sadiq is down there. And we're working on trying to get our young African Americans how to swim and scuba dive so that they can visit the Clotilda ship, so that they understand how important the water is to our community. And so those are the kind of things that we're preserving, both buildings and structures and places and things. We're also working with a group in terms of planting fruit trees and others in the community. When you read Barracoon, Joe Lewis talk about fruit trees in that book, I mean, we had fruit trees and berries all over the community. And so those are the kind of things that we're trying to bring back as a part of pushing back to get individuals to understand the richness of the community and the vision and the kind of work that was done in spite of the pushback that came with individuals. So that's sort of our story in terms of the preservation process.
Yeah, that's awesome. It's almost like cultural preservation through an ecology, nature, and culture. It's, yeah, really innovative work. I'm curious about your one big challenge in the work. Like, what keeps you up at night? What new solution do you need? What is the biggest challenge that you're currently facing?
I think if I could just go back 1 second, I would be remiss if I didn't mention that the rubric, the Engaging Descendant Community rubric established in 2018, formed by many folks who are in this room here today, guides, I think, all of our work and is the methodology for how to go about the ethical engagement of communities in research, interpretation, and relationships. And that as a relatively early career professional has helped me considerably in my own development as a historian working with descendants and descendant communities. And I think that what has kept me up at night in 2021, when I came on board, well, communicating, I suppose, about a disinterment of human remains from a burial site in the 1980s and having to communicate that to our descendant community and working with descendant families to reinter the remains that had been not interred. That was something that kept me up for many months. And because of the rubric, because of the people who are within our community, because of the trust that they place in the people who've been doing this work for generations, we were able to learn from that. But the work can be challenging, spiritually, personally, there's no question. There's not many boundaries in this kind of work, but it is inspiring nonetheless and pushes us forward. So thank you.
So I think I mentioned earlier that I'm heavily involved in the DNA aspects of a lot of this research. And we've got the physical structures in some cases, we've got cemeteries in some cases, but we also have the living people who have in them DNA that can help us work our way back scientifically with accuracy and several generations. And I guess one of the things that's kind of a two-part thing that keeps me up at night, one is that I believe we're in a window of opportunity that we shouldn't squander. And the generations before us, they're dealing with dogs and hoses and back of the bus, and you can't eat at this counter, and you can't go to this school, and all of that kind of stuff. And then we come along, our generation comes along, and all of a sudden you've got the internet, and you've got other things opening up, and you've got technology moving in light speed ways, and you've got a lot of these companies, at least as it relates to the DNA part of this, that are offering lots of things, and they're still in its infancy, if you will, in terms of what you can and can't do. And you've got people having these healthy discussions about what's right look like. People talk about small segments, and can you use a small segment to find an African descendant? Well, I can say yes, you can. But there's a lot of companies that want to say, well, those segments are too small. They might be false. Let's turn the switch off. We don't need those. They're just in the way. And so So what's keeping me up at night is that these companies are going to start to draw back on some of the capabilities that are in existence right now and make it even harder for us to do this work. And so the second thing I would say is that I'm concerned about the young people. Because again, if the generation before us was just fighting to survive and stay alive, and now we're in this window of opportunity, so you go to the next group, and are they willing and receptive? Are they willing to take the ball? And after the heavy lifting is done, are we going to have a dance partner to hand this off to? And I stay up at night worrying about the next generation and having somebody to provide some continuity for what we're trying to do here.
So I heard a challenge to HBCUs through their science. Y'all heard that too, right? HBCUs can be an opportunity for expanded DNA research. And I also heard a challenge to some of these young folks that we see sitting right here in the audience to carry the mantle.
What keeps me up at night is climate change, but not in just one way. Three kinds of climate change: economic climate change, environmental climate change, and what I will say, cultural climate change. So the economics of being involved in this work, we're watching, I know in North Carolina, we're watching the Great Resignation definitely hit the cultural fields, and we're also noticing that the salaries are not at all keeping pace with the cost of living. And so we're seeing a need for more innovative economic models to support the work for a new generation of public humanities professionals. We're also seeing that this economic climate change means that we have to be more interdisciplinary and with the sciences, but also with the art world, bringing in our friends and colleagues from the galleries and who do performance art to activate these spaces. And so that's my economic climate change concern, is that we need to keep leaning into this succession planning that means we have to be innovative and magnetic. In terms of the environmental climate change, I'll give you the example. I'm glad you called out Ann Chin, who has been working tirelessly to encourage North Carolina to commemorate the spaces of disembarkation of enslaved people from the time that I've met you for quite a while ago, and we have been seeing advancements in that. So Brunswick Town, Fort Anderson, which is in Brunswick County, North Carolina, near the northern edge of the Gullah Geechee Cultural Heritage Corridor. So the Gullah Corridor goes from Pender County, North Carolina, in the lower Cape Fear, all the way to northern Florida. But we know that there were many slaving ships that came into Brunswick Town, Fort Anderson. But the climate change issue there means that we are seeing erosion. And so we're having to think in an innovative way around wave attenuators. You know, how do we put technology out in the water to prevent massive chunks of earth from washing away into the Cape Fear River, taking with the water artifacts that tell the story of those early moments of collision of African and European and indigenous people. The third climate change is the culture wars that we're in right now. And the censorship war, the war against common sense decision-making around equity and justice-oriented public history, and the pendulum swing that hit us all upside the head after the great uprisings of 2020, which, of course, was the result of the son of a woman named Larcenia Jones Floyd, named Sissy, who was born in a place called New Hope in Wayne County, North Carolina, and gave birth to a son named George Perry Floyd Jr. in a place called Womack Hospital at Fort Bragg in North Carolina. The lynching of this man and the global uprising that resulted from his lynching, the pendulum swing, that the response to our uprisings, many of us predicted. Many of us saw that this movement to meet the moment as keepers of memory, many of us saw that we would be attacked. And so that's a kind of climate change that I also know that we're in it. We're in the midst of it. And so how do we take care of ourselves and each other? And how do we do, as my Aunt Louise says, march forward? So.
The thing that keeps me up, as some of you know, whenever somebody's talking, I said, you know, if you think you have it bad, just say Alabama. You know, just say Alabama. Because many of you know in 1901, Alabama, as many southern states rewrote their constitution. And Alabama has probably still the longest constitution in the world and in this country. And so the thing that bothers me is policies, how those policies are either neglected, changed, or reinforced. The solution for me is, as Curtis Hart say, you can either have a pity party or you can beat them with success. I have 5 young people that I call every morning through text or telephone call. And I keep saying to them, you're in charge. You're in charge. When I go to Mobile and I have meetings with certain city or county or governmental officials, I take one of those individuals with me. If they have to work that day, I say, I will pay your daily wage to go with me. We have to put our young people at the policy-making tables. Our HBCUs must educate our young people to be policy change people. I had the privilege of meeting Maynard Jackson, Julian Bonds, Andy, who's still with us, and a number of others. Maynard did something that was revolutionary. He put together that talented tent. And he drew a line in the sand when the airport was being built. Not a spade of dirt will be moved unless there are black contractors. He understood what policy meant from an economic standpoint and a political standpoint. We have to adopt those kinds of processes to make change. Our HBCUs must be at the forefront of making those changes. So that is what keeps me up. But I also offer solutions for that, and it's called Beating Up with Success. Thank you.
Yeah, that was fantastic. We got 10 minutes, and I've got 2 more questions. So in our work, I think we all can agree that what holds memory can also hold healing. So I want to ask you, how do you care for yourself, given the difficulty of some of the work and the challenges as you describe, whether it's economic, cultural, or just the difficulty of remembering the truth about American history? What's your self-care treatment?
I'll go first on this one. My self-care is family and friends. I can call Ann Chin at 7 o'clock in the morning. I don't know where she's going to be at in the country. It is having people in your life who care about you, and you feel that care, and they will say, take care of yourself. Take time to rest and breathe. We need you. It is those kind of reminders to make a difference. It is having the people in your lives who will send you presents out of the blue in the sky that are in your lives. So it's really about building a family or maintaining that family, and that family can be kin, and sometimes kin can be unnerving. And a lot of times, and sometimes it's friends that help you stay the course. My wife, I actually came up here Wednesday, and my wife said, you need to go early, because if you stay here, you're gonna keep working 10 different things. When you get there, you only wanna work 5, okay? Because you don't have all the stuff in front of you. So she sees sometimes that I need to get away, that we need to get away. And so she demands it. My daughter does the same thing. My close friends do the same thing. I have a friend in South Carolina. He will say, look, I've got a timeshare for you, already paid for, go take it, and stuff. And so I've been extremely blessed, having friends and family in my life to help me stay the course in terms of recognizing this work. Some of them are not as diligent in it as I am, but they support me in various ways. And so that's how I kind of heal myself and stay calm.
I'm still working to figure this question out in this reality that we're in right now. I think I've done well with some aspects of it, but I believe I have a ways to go before I say, oh yeah, I've hit the sweet spot. So I'm just saying that. I'm being honest, because I think it's important to be honest with each other. I also love the love of my village, and I like the power of having multiple villages. I believe that dance is an important tool for catharsis and joy, and I happen to believe that the electric slide is a great folk dance of the African American people, and sometimes I'll just be in the house doing the electric slide, just trying to, work it out. My husband and I are big fans of comedy, so we'll go to a comedy show. Laughter is so healing. I learned that from someone who worked here. There was a security guard who guards the casket of Emmett Till, and I said, how are you taking care of yourself? And he said, I watch a lot of comedy. I watch a lot. So I learned that here. So those are some tools that I use.
I guess I take care of myself by not doing this alone. I'm a member of AAHC, the Afro-American Historical and Genealogical Society. And, there's like-minded people that are all working on their pieces of the pie, trying to solve some of this stuff. And when you hit a brick wall, or you get stumped, or it gets frustrating, you can call somebody, and they'll know how the pain that you're feeling, or how the stress that you're going through. They'll have some sympathy and appreciation, and maybe even some help in helping to move through that. So AAHC is certainly important. I'm also linked in with a number of the DNA community. I mean, we're technical, geeky people when you get into the weeds, and I'm telling you, the stuff that DNA, I believe, is going to do, if the African American community gets more into this and gets over some of the apprehension and just gets that information into a space where the scientists among us can really work with that stuff, we're going to be able to do some things. And so I'm in cahoots with a lot of DNA folks and that really can get frustrating, but to be able to bounce some things and share ideas in that regard. And then the immediate family, the wife, and the other people that are helping you, providing you with the testing, to not to say no, they're saying yes. What do you need? I need your DNA, So I'm getting help in that regard, and I think, in the aggregate, I'm getting enough help to make it work.
Yeah, friends, family, community, it means everything. I wish I could dance, y'all, but I got no hope. So what I got to do is instead work on integrating these aspects, the challenges, the joys, into my being, and that's the lessons that I've learned from dealing with complicated family history personally, what I've learned dealing with history professionally and academically, and knowing that the challenges are not going to stay at bay, that they're going to keep coming, if I can open myself to integrating them into the reality and not repressing them, and instead focusing on working with folks who are just inspire me every day.
Nice. So my last question, and I'm gonna give you an option. You can leave a closing remark for the audience, something that you want them to hold and consider as part of this symposium and summit. Or, I think a lot of times with historic preservation, we're looking to the past to preserve historic places in the present, but in essence, our work is about the future. It's Afrofuturist, and so what's the big dream through an Afrofuturist lens for descendant engagement in historic preservation?
I'll start. Several years ago, I was sitting at the Center for Documentary Studies listening to a panel that included MacArthur Genius Award-winning environmental justice warrior Catherine Flowers, who wrote the book Waste, and she was accompanied by a Black geographer, Danielle Purifoy, and artist Turquoise Dyson. And my mind was blown, and in that moment, I understood the power of place making and how we can activate place as like a portal for time travel by just putting foot to soil or skin to soil, and just the power of going, the power of the sojourn. Fast forward, and last year, 2022, at the Olympics of the art world, Venice Biennale, for the first time ever, a Black woman was representing the United States of America in our pavilion there, and her name was Simone Lee, and her exhibit is called Sovereignty, and it was dealing with many of the things that we're talking about today. I had the opportunity to go to Venice and see this exhibit, and I decided to be there because one of her inspirations is Harriet Jacobs, who we talk about all the time at Historic Edenton. When I got to Venice, to this exhibit, I was by myself, and this was clearly a Black woman's space. And I said, this will not do. Well, I had just learned about this augmented reality app called Brianna's Garden. And it was created by Lady Phoenix and Breonna Taylor's sister. You can all download it. And I thought, I can't be in the space alone. I need other Black women with me. And I knew I had the app on my phone. And so I opened up my phone and I activated the app. And there emerged a garden with butterflies. And there before me, through augmented reality, Breonna Taylor was resurrected, and her sister joined her. And I was able to be with this ancestral sister of all of ours in Venice, Italy, looking at a pavilion that was never meant for the aesthetics of a Black woman. And we crossed dimensions in time together, and there was a source of healing and transformation that happened at the soul level that continues to inspire my work as a womanist cartographer, and has even inspired me to pursue a doctorate degree in human geography. And so I'm thinking about the power of place and counter cartography and augmented reality as a way that we can lean into the art world and the creativity of these new generations to be able to touch our ancestors at any given moment.
I hope for historic plantation sites is that resources will be allocated for the future generations through grant programs, whether they're scholarships or outright awards, to allow for younger descendants to come up and pursue their dreams. And also with the historic landscape that Michelle's describing, that sites will not be financially exclusive to descendants who are interested in connecting with the landscape, that we may open, at Monticello, for instance, there's 2,500 acres that are under, actually it's now about 3,000 acres that are under our preservation. That's what we've stewarded for the last 100 years or so. We only interpret a very small minority of that, and much of the mountaintop is not accessible to the everyday visitor. And my hope would be to turn back these sites, to open them to folks who are interested in being on the historic landscape and exploring and learning from the ecology and the feeling that you have from walking the grounds and not necessarily, not at all, visiting Thomas Jefferson's home if you're not interested in doing so. And then lastly, to preserve our voices now, particularly as it relates to the last several generations, and to gift that to the future, I think is among the blessings that we can impart to posterity.
So Jerome, and then Anderson, and brief closing remark.
So my hope would be to continue the transparency, continue the honesty, to talk about what happened in real terms. We can't sugarcoat what happened in the past. And for some of the institutions and sites that have made that shift in their interpretation, in that narrative, where they're going to tell the story and they're going to be inclusive and tell everybody's story and let it all sort out on its own weight, as opposed to trying to slant it one way to make somebody else look good at the expense of somebody else. Put it out there and continue to be real and honest about what we all went through and what, in many cases, we continue to go through. Let's get some truth in this.
Yeah.
My hope and what I'm really trying to work on is creating those narratives that do tell our story and having young people be a part of it. Dr. Alex Jones, who's an archaeologist, will be coming down next week to Alabama. And one of the things as a part of her project is to have young people be at the cemetery being students in terms of the middle school and the high school, that they are a part of the process of developing the curriculums and the outcomes to those things. And so I think for me that is really exciting to know that we need to produce more archaeologists, we need to be able to produce more individuals with the skills and the talent to write our narratives and write our story, to be inclusive, but tell it from our perspective and to connect those pieces together. And so I'm seeing that happening, and I'm hoping that the National Trust and the Action Fund get more money so that they can fund more of these processes. But that's really my hope, and I'm seeing that happening, and I have a great deal of excitement about it from that standpoint.
Let's hear it for our amazing panel. Yeah, that was fantastic.
And right now, we're going to have poet Damaris Hill come and speak to us about creative practices in honoring our ancestors, and then we will wrap up for lunch.